Well, as you can see, Brother Greg's not with us teaching, and Mike, who helped us out last week, is gone as well. And I think Greg, sort of getting ready to part, realized he'd asked Mike, or James to preach, rather, or to teach, and he looked around and said, well, James is not going to be here, and possibly Monty's not going to be here, and a number of others. And oh, there's Tom. Maybe we'll ask him. So, So I guess I got elected to come and teach. Fortunately, we're in the book of Luke. If you want to turn over there with us this morning, we're going to be basically in the 6th chapter. James left us off with finishing up with about verse 5 last week. But as we look at that concept that's presented in there, and we look at the principle that Luke was in his purpose for writing this book, he was trying to give us a sort of a semi-chronological order of events that happened and how, Jesus started his ministry, and he developed in that, and he goes in and gives us some pretty decent details. But Luke goes in and adds some information to his account that, we in our general reading we might just tend to overlook and not really comprehend of the thoughts that he's presented there. But he's been sort of building this situation or this event record up as he goes through. And one of the things that he's brought to our attention a lot of times is Jesus's relationship with the people and his constant attendance and association with the Jewish synagogues. And he goes through there and he talks about that. And Luke has gone through, and when he started in his ministry, he's sort of brought that to our attention several different times. He brought it to our attention there in Nazareth and Capernaum and other things. We talked about last week where, he was going through and doing various different things, and it was in the synagogue. And he starts to bring in another little concept that is going to sort of be evident all through Jesus' ministry. And that's the conflict with Jesus and the Jewish leaders. And we might look at that and we'll see some of the things that he brings out. And he particularly points out the Pharisees and the Scribes. And we might just generally think that, that included all of these Pharisees and Scribes, that they were all of this sort of antagonistic, we're going to get him type attitude. But he's sort of lumping them all in that situation, because we can look at other places where there were certain Pharisees that had a little more of a different heart, a different thought about things, and that they presented those thoughts, and they approached Jesus. They really wanted to know, what was he really here for? Who was he? Why does he have the authority that he has? You might think about some of these, like Nicodemus. We look over the book of John and we see Nicodemus came to Jesus by night because he wanted to know these things. Because basically what was happening when Jesus was out with the group and all these Pharisees, they were getting sort of lumped together. And they were sort of being very vocal in what they were saying. And he wanted to find out, really, what was Jesus trying to say? What was he doing? Who was he? And why was his teaching seemed so much different than the traditions of these Pharisees and Jewish leaders? So there in verse, chapter 6, he goes through and he talks about, there in verse 1, it says, now it came about that on a certain Sabbath, Jesus, was passing through the fields with his disciples, and they came, and some of the Pharisees said, why do you say this and lawful on the Sabbath? It's sort of implied that they were going through and passing through these fields on the Sabbath, and they were headed someplace. And evidently they were there at one of the synagogues, and that's when these Pharisees and Scribes came to him and asked him, well, why are you doing this? And it's interesting that when he goes through there in verse 6, he tells them who he was. There in verse 5 he says, and he was saying to them, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. So when we look at that, there's two really concepts that he presents out. That one, the Son of Man. What does that Son of Man make reference to? Is he just saying, is it just the Son of Man? I'm a son of man. My dad was a man. I'm his son. So am I the Son of Man that he's talking, or are any of you men the Son of Men that he's making reference to? What is he really making reference to when he says the Son of Man? Monty?
I believe he's making reference to his deity and the fulfillment of prophecy, that they would be the only begotten Son of God come in the flesh to be the Messiah, to save the world from their sins. So I believe that's what he's talking about there.
All right, that's really what he's doing. And so he's going through, he's telling right up front here, very close to the beginning of his ministry, he's telling these religious leaders who he is. And some of you might look at your Bibles and things, and you'll see that the phrase there, the Son of Man, is capitalized. It's making that reference to him being the Messiah. But not only does he claim he's the Son of Man, or this Messiah that's talking about, what is he also making reference to? The last part of that phrase is just this, he says the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. What does he mean, the Lord of the Sabbath? Any ideas? Monty?
Yeah, I think he's talking about he made up the rules of the Sabbath. When they was talking about his disciples violating the Sabbath, and he says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying, I'm God in the flesh. I made the rules. I know what they are, and my disciples haven't violated them. If they were going to be violating them, he would have put a stop to it in advance. He wouldn't have allowed that to happen so that they wouldn't have had something to complain about, realistically. But he's saying, I know what the rules are. I made them, and there's not a problem here.
So when he makes this rule, what violation did the Pharisees think that his disciples had made at the time? Money.
Where they'd gone through the grain fields and they'd plucked the heads of grain, was rubbing them in their hand and blowing the chaff out and eating the grain. They were saying that was working on the Sabbath.
Okay. So was it wrong to work on the Sabbath? Okay, but there was a definition of what the work in the Old Testament. It spelled out, specifically what that was. Who can think of some examples of when somebody went out and did something on the Sabbath and God severely punished them?
Couldn't gather firewood. You couldn't build fire.
Couldn't build fire. But what about them in their journey on their 40 years? What was the rule that was set aside there?
The manna, they had they could pick it, they could gather it 6 days, but they couldn't gather it on the Sabbath.
And what happens if they did gather more than they were supposed to?
Worms in it.
It got worms in it. So, the Lord went through and he started establishing his Sabbath. He started setting what. And what happened when they found this guy out working, picking up sticks and doing things, trying to build a fire on the Sabbath? He was supposed to be stoned. So, yeah, there was stipulations in there for what work was. and Jesus, knew what those stipulations were. Did the Pharisees know what those stipulations were? What was the difference between what the Pharisees and these scribes were trying to impose on the people than what Jesus was trying to explain?
Well, they thought they knew. I think they pointed this one out and tried to catch it if it was wrong.
Yeah. But the biggest problem they had is they had the physical law that they had that was right in place, but they'd gone through and made up all their little caveats or asterisks and things that would go through and be added on to that. Well, you could do this, but you couldn't do that. You couldn't do this, but you could do this. And if it violated what they thought, what their opinion of the law was, then it was wrong. And Jesus starts making this point out. Then we go through and let's read down through 6 to about 11. It says, and then it came about on another Sabbath that he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and there was a man there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees were watching him closely to see if he healed on the Sabbath in order that they might find reason to accuse him. But he knew what they were thinking, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Rise and come forward." And he rose and came forward. And Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save a life or destroy it?" And after looking around at all of them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus. When you read this account, what do you think about? What's your initial concept of what is transpiring right here? There's about 3 or 4 or 5 things that we can sort of see from these few verses. Bonnie?
First thing I think about as I read the whole thing is the hypocrisy of these scribes and Pharisees. Jesus stood up and asked them a question: Is it okay to save a life or destroy? Is it okay to do good or do evil on the Sabbath day? Well, they didn't want to answer because they probably expected what he was talking about was healing this man, because he'd done asked him to come up and come forward and stand right here. But then when he did do something, make this miracle and heal this man, they went away angry. They went away mad. And so to me, it's the hypocrisy. It would be obvious that Jesus had to be a messenger from God, because nobody else could have healed the man, or he would have been healed already. So that demonstrates the power of God working in him. And for them to go away mad about that just kind of overwhelms me.
Well, that's another point. Rita?
They also had, it's like their attitude. They were already looking for something wrong, and then, when he kind of put them in a position where they couldn't answer, they had to work.
Those two of the points there. The very first point that Luke brings up is that, he was where? Where was Jesus at? It says at another time he was at the synagogue. Sort of, Luke is implying this was Jesus' regular procedure. Almost each and every Sabbath, he was where? At the synagogue. What was he trying to do? Teach and instruct the people. What were the synagogues sort of established to do? Wasn't that their purpose? Weren't they there to try to worship God? Weren't they there trying to learn what the law had to say? We see that Paul followed some of those same things. That there was teaching, there was reading of the Scriptures, there were various other different aspects that was going on. Jesus went there to do that. He also had basically a following of people that were there too. You're trying to reach and teach someplace. Where's the most logical place to go to teach somebody about God? Place where people assemble about God, right? You've basically got a ready-made audience. Sort of the implication and situation that the Pharisees came there not so much to worship God, but what did they come there to do? What was that?
Seems like it's Jesus doing something that they thought he should do.
All right. Were they coming there with the right attitude, as Rita mentioned? Their attitude was totally different. They weren't there to worship God, were they?
They were there to be worshipped by the people that were coming there.
They were there to be worshipped by the people who were coming there. They were also there to discredit the person, somebody that disagreed with them.
They wanted to have their way of life changed. They wanted to keep their status as it was. And Jesus was a huge threat to that, because he was going to change everything.
And it's, so sometimes, we start to have to ask our question, why are we here? Are we here to worship God? Are we here to try to catch somebody in some error? How many people, sit and just, sit and wait for maybe the preacher to make a misspoke, or quote the wrong passage, or, say something out of context. And they might be the first ones to go back and tell him about it. And, and what do you think about, what are these people really trying to do? Are they really trying to learn what's, to be presented? Or are they trying to make themselves more important. So, these are some of the thoughts that are being brought up.
What stands out about that to me, these verses, is Jesus did no work there. He just spoke. As far as we understand, and as far as we know what the Scripture says, he didn't even touch the man.
Right.
He just spoke to it. And they just accused him of doing work.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting how he goes through and he presents this. How does he go through and, evidently there was a miracle that was performed, right? So how does he present or lead into this miracle? There was an opportunity, right? There was a man there with a withered hand. And Jesus asked a couple simple questions, right? What were those questions that he asked? Monty?
Is it okay to do good or evil? Is it okay to save a life or to destroy?
Okay. Why was this, when we think about this question that was asked, why would Jesus ask that question? And who was he asking it to? Was he asking it to everyone that was there? Or was he directing it to a particular group of people?
He was directing it to the Scribes and Pharisees, because it says at the beginning of verse 8, or verse 7, that they were watching him closely to see if he'd heal on the Sabbath, that they could accuse him. And in verse 8 it said he knew their thoughts. And so he was directing the question to them because he knew their thoughts, knew that they were watching out for him. And basically he was wanting them to answer the question of whether this was going to be an okay thing or not themselves. If they just said, well, yeah, it's naturally good it's naturally okay to do good on the Sabbath, then he could have done it. And if they grumbled, he could say, what's wrong? You said it was okay. But even the way it worked out, he asked them the question. They were supposed to be the religious leaders that knew the law the best, and they wouldn't give him an answer. So even at that, if they had to openly grumble against him, he'd say, well, you didn't give me an answer, so it must have been okay.
Yeah. Now, do you believe that there were some implied things in the law of the Sabbath that said that, that excluded or that changed work?
If one of their animals fell into a pit, they were allowed to get it out.
Right. So there were things that you were allowed to do, but if you had to classify it, was that work? It was work. But the problem is, if you didn't do that work, what happened? There's a whole host of things that we could look at the concept that goes in there. One, it could be the loss of a livelihood for the individual. Two, you had just basically the compassion on the animal for being suffered. Have you ever seen an animal in a pit or situation like that, Monty?
One thing that was an exception to the law as far as work went, and Jesus pointed out in another place, that the priest technically violated the law every Sabbath because they went through all the work in the process of killing the offerings and cutting it up the way God and the law had described and making the burnt offerings and sacrifices. And he said, they do work on the Sabbath and you don't fuss at them. And so Jesus understood there were certain things that, even though in the most technical sense of the word might have been considered work, but they were also commands of God or authorized by God to do, and therefore had to be done on the Sabbath.
All right. So he's asking this question. Now, if you take that question and you go back to that verse 5, what's he sort of proving with what the question that he's asking? Remember what he said in verse 5? He said there, he says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. All right. Now he's asking them a question. Is it all right to do good or evil on the Sabbath day? Is it all right to save a life or destroy it? And then what does he do? He heals a man with a withered hand. All right? Was that a good thing?
That man thought it was.
Man thought it was. All right.
It just seems like they're trying to trap him in their traditions, and he turned the law around on them.
He turned the law around on them. He, as the Lord of the Sabbath, he knew the Sabbath, he knew the rules, he knew the principle that was being presented for it, and being the Lord of the Sabbath, He has that ability and the authority to do what he did, right? So he's sort of putting a question to them that, that they didn't really want to answer, did they? And we don't have an answer recorded for us. Rita?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that he's performing a miracle right in front of them. And yet their attitude, I mean, I don't see anything like wow or anything like that. I mean, to me, if I saw somebody do that, I mean, it would kind of take me back, at least a little bit. But what he's doing is he's proving he is Lord of the Sabbath.
And not only that, he's proving that he's the Son of God, right? So he's going through and doing, he's showing them exactly who he is, and he's going through and he's confronting their whole, basically, traditional way and putting it out of the way. Have you thought, why didn't they answer him yes or no? And it seems like he pauses and waits for an answer from them that they don't give. And that's sort of a scenario through a lot of his ministry. He does that over and over again. Monty?
It seems like the reason they didn't answer him was just like when you ask him the question, is John the Baptist a prophet? Is his message from God or men? And they said, well, if we say he's from God, then he's going to say, why didn't we obey him? If we say he's from men, the people astonish us because they think he's from God. And so he had them between a rock and a hard place, so their solution was just not to answer at all and try to do the best they could with the situation.
JD?
It's amazing how they kind of bring the same stuff back up over and over again. I mean, if you look in Luke chapter 14, around verse 5, same situation about the Sabbath, and he tells them, if either one, if y'all had an ox that fell into a pit on the Sabbath, wouldn't you pull it straight out? And of course, they didn't really want to say anything. But the point being is something good that needs to be done is not unlawful.
So he goes through it almost over and over and over again. You have this scenario. And you have this sort of type of people that are always going to be confrontational or not really wanting to accept what God instructs them to do, right? We sort of pointed out last week that that's sort of been the nature of the children of Israel in a lot of different ways. They never really wanted to accept what God wanted them to do. They wanted to do it their way. Burger King used to do, a commercial all the time. Have it your way. You could have it with pickles or without pickles, with cheese, without cheese, with ketchup, without ketchup. You could tell them what you wanted, and they'd give it to you. And that's sort of the way that these Pharisees were, but they wanted it, you do it our way, or it's not acceptable. You walk into Burger King, and the guy says, "I want no pickles." Oh, you can't have it that way. You got to have pickles. Well, I don't want pickles. Well, you got to have pickles anyway because that's the way we're making it. How would you go back? Pretty soon you'd get tired of it. I'm not going there. They never fix it the way I want. But the thing is, that's a hamburger. It's not the Word of God. And here you had these individuals that were just going through and trying to make the people do it that way. So what's the scenario when here you've got this synagogue, evidently, that's not just full of Pharisees and Scribes. There are other people there, common people as well. There's some of the disciples of Jesus that are with him, is right? So what happens when you see somebody that has the attitude of the Pharisees? I agree. Do you side with them? Or do you sit back and think about, what are they? Why are they confronting this individual? And then you see the miracle, and there's even more things. Why would somebody be objecting to somebody doing this? Why would be, what is the purpose? Monty.
They have been the authority and the last word on any subject and related to the whole Jewish nation ultimately, other than, I guess, whoever their captors might have been. But nevertheless, they were the authority. They were in charge. Well, if you've got somebody here that can do these miracles, that prove in they're obviously from God, that their message is from God, it threatens your power base. So ultimately, they didn't like Jesus, not because he was doing good stuff, but because he's saying, I'm the one you was looking for, and y'all aren't going to be the men anymore.
No. So now, let's go step forward a little bit. Paul was a Pharisee, right? Do you think Paul had this same attitude that these Pharisees had prior to being converted? Huh?
More attitude than
Possibly more. But the thing with Paul, Paul felt comfortable or confident that he was doing things according to law. At least what he did was according to the law. He wasn't, the indication is that he wasn't doing it out of tradition. He was going to the law. And then when he started seeing what was being taught in Jesus' name, and why was, he was already in this situation of where he said, he was pushing against something that he didn't have a real reason for. Maybe it conflicted with his traditions, and he could understand traditions. Traditions are some things that some of them are good, some of them are bad, some of them are according to God's law, some of them aren't. All right, and being able to. So I think when we start looking at the life of Paul, he understood which ones were the law and which ones were traditions. All right? We sort of see that same picture with Nicodemus. Nicodemus saw this. He was a Pharisee, and that was a concept of him. And we see this here transpiring through the Gospels, that there were this group of individuals. They didn't care really what God's law said. They wanted their traditions. They wanted to be in that power. And this is that group he's talking about. Then when Paul was preaching and he was going around from place to place, there were these Judaizing teachers. What were they? They had the same attitude that these Pharisees had. They wanted it the way that it always was, where they were in control, and they didn't care whether it was from God or not. It caused problems with them and their ability to be in charge. And that's sort of an attitude that is presented. And we have that attitude throughout the world. We see it in our political situations. We see it in businesses. We see it in all kinds of things. When I worked, in the IT world and everything, we had a technology officer, and his concept was, if it's not my idea, it's a bad idea. And he would spend money on things that didn't make any money. But it was his idea, so that's what he wanted to go with. And it didn't matter. You could present an idea that was a lot more logical. It was a lot more economical. It produced a lot more income. He didn't want it because he had that same concept as Pharisees. And we run into type of people like that all over in every walk of life and everything. So we can easily see it. But here Jesus is doing this. He's in the synagogue. He's in a group of people, and this transpires. People are starting to ask questions. Why are these Pharisees, that are supposedly our leaders, so adamantly against him and trying to, discredit him? That'd be sort of a normal question that a lot of common people would ask. I would be asked, what is your problem with it? He's doing something wrong, doing something great, and you have a problem with it. Now, there was a problem that they had was because, situation with blasphemy. What is blasphemy? And why was it so wrong?
It means
To speak against. And speak against who? Particularly when, the blasphemy that we're talking about in religious, speaking against God. Was Jesus speaking against God? Okay. And I think he's starting to show that he's speaking with God. All right. So what does he finally do? After he asks that question, then he turns around and he looks at him. After he asks that question, and then he looks to the man and he says, "Stretch out your hand." And he did so, and his hand was restored. And then verse 11, Luke puts that there, and it just, sort of starts putting that hammer to the nail to their attitude. He says, "But they themselves were filled with rage and discussed together what they might do to Jesus." This is sort of the first block in the steps to have him arrested. And it's probably 2 to 3 years later that this is going to happen. But they started planning and plotting and working together to do this. And you can sort of see them. So what do? They start following him where he's going. Start building a case against him. And as the more they see, you'd think, well, this guy really is who he says he is. But as they follow him, they get filled with more and more rage. Because why? They couldn't explain why he was doing what he was doing. It was against their traditions. And they were so set in their traditions that they couldn't move past it. And then we change from this aspect to another aspect. The calling of, or actually the naming of the apostles. We had, what is the difference between a disciple and an apostle?
We're all disciples.
What's that?
We're all disciples. Christians are disciples. Apostles were chosen by Jesus to do specific work, a specific point in our history.
All right. There's other reference of other people being made apostles. Monty?
The definition of a disciple is a follower of a particular belief system or teacher. The definition of the word apostle is one sent. So these 12 men that he lists here, that he's going to talk about in a minute, have made a step up, you might say, in their work from being a follower of Jesus. Now they're not only a follower, but they're also being sent to do a particular work or to spread the message. So they've gone from being students to teachers.
All right. Now,
Eyewitnesses also.
what's that?
They were eyewitnesses also.
They were eyewitnesses as well. Now, the other thing, too, is we start looking at this. Those that became the apostles, they were first disciples. Who did we talk about last week? There's basically 4 or 5 that we talked about last week that, Jesus called in various different ways. Who were the first 4 that we talked about, a couple weeks ago? Well, Matthew was one last week. The 4 before that, we had this sort of calling, and we're sort of looking at a difference. Luke does something pretty significant there. He introduces 4 that Jesus calls personally, and then we see these 12 that are basically, chosen. All right. Who were the first 4 that he called, and how did he call them?
Fishermen, James, John.
And Andrew, right? All right. So there you have 4, and then we have Levi, right? So we have at least these 4 that were identified. And then we had another one too, but was it Nathaniel? They're talked about and Philip, that were 6. There's about 6 or 7 that were personally identified as individuals to follow Jesus. All right. When they were first called, they were disciples. Some of them were disciples of somebody else. Who were they disciples of? Huh?
John.
Of John. All right. So here you had some that were disciples of John, they saw Jesus, and they became disciples of Jesus. But here we had, at least 6. How many other disciples did Jesus have? Disciples.
Disciples, a lot.
A lot. He had a lot of followers. And here, Luke, and even in some of these first miracles and things, these were disciples, or these close people that were following him, but there were others that were there that witnessed these miracles and things that he had. All right? So sometimes we're sitting there and we're reading, and we're sort of, we read about these apostles that were disciples, but they weren't yet apostles. They were disciples, but they were personally identified by Jesus and later became apostles. All right? So prior to this, we had at least Peter, James, John, Andrew, Matthew, Levi, probably Nathaniel, and Philip, that Jesus had identified as followers or disciples And they had started going out around with him and seeing some of the miracles and things that happened. Even to the point where Jesus had already started, having a really personal relationship with these. And then in verse 12 and following, he starts going through, and we see that from all these disciples, he starts and he chooses these 12. Let's read there in verse 12 and following. And it was this time he went off to a mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples to him, and he chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he also named Peter, Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon who's also called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot who became a traitor. And he descended with them and stood on level ground, on a level place, and there was a great multitude of his disciples and a great throng of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coastal regions of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured, and all the multitudes were trying to touch him, for the power was coming from him, and he was healing them all. All right? So we see a total, differences between these 12 and his disciples. Even in the same passages, they're evidently when he went up to the mountain to pray, this was another situation. When he was in a situation, what did he do? How did Jesus handle difficult situations or difficult decisions? He prayed about it first. But did he just stop? Oh, Lord, please help me with this problem. A lot of times we see it was all night long that he prayed about it. It was, these were important decisions. How much time do we spend on important decisions? Did any of you pray all night before you got married? That was an important decision, wasn't it? How about before you bought your house? Did you pray about it? Sometimes, we look at important decisions in our life and we sort of just go through them and we really don't include God in what we're doing. Jesus, in every important decision he had, went to his Father in prayer. And he just didn't do it. Most of the time, it was all night or for several hours that he spent time in prayer. Here he was choosing 12 out of his many disciples to carry on what he wanted to carry on. He was establishing that foundation of the kingdom.
So, but he's God, so he knows who he's going to pick, and he knows what they're going to do. But what is he praying about all night, though? I'm just a little unclear about that.
I don't know. But it was something that he was really concerned about. Some of it, he knew that in choosing this, it was going to fulfill prophecy. And in fulfilling that prophecy, he was going to prove, he was going to prove to all of us really who he was, right? Now, he could have gone and chose, he could have said, I don't want to choose Judas Iscariot. He's not, I don't like him. I know he's going to betray me. Why would I choose him? It's a hard question to answer, isn't it?
It's a hard question to answer, but I also think about when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's praying to God and said, "If it's thy will, let this cup pass from me." Well, we know that he had to die, but yet, as a man, that was a lot he was going to have to tolerate physically, and he sweated drops of blood. He was so stressed over this. So, just being maybe that part of the man he saw.
So Kristen just said to me, maybe similar to why he was baptized, he did that to fulfill all righteousness, but he didn't need to repent of his sins right thing to do to pray to God for big decisions. Because, I mean, Clifton's point, he knew who he was going to pick, but he wanted to communicate to his father before he did it, just because it was the right thing to do, if nothing else.
And I think that's really going through, but I think the important thing is, regardless about knowing what was going to transpire, who he was going to choose, he still went to God about prayer and, and seek that intimacy with his father that the decision was being made. And, sometimes we know that we're going to buy a house, but do we really consult with our, God about doing that? Bonnie?
When we read this, it says he prayed all night and then he chose the 12. We're assuming that he prayed all night about his choosing the 12. There was very possible and very probable there was a lot of things he prayed about that night in praying all night long. I would assume that part of it, at least, was about the choice he was fixing to make. But nevertheless, I wouldn't necessarily assume that the whole night long was about that. The Bible doesn't say that that's all he prayed about. And so for us to sit here, well, he prayed all night about picking his apostles. Well, we don't know that. So I think we need to be a little bit careful on that. As was mentioned, yes, he probably already in advance knew. Maybe he spent a lot of his time praying for them that they would do this work that he was going to assign to them well. Not that he had uncertainties about his choice that he was making, but that he was praying individually for them. I mean, there's a lot of things he could have been praying about. And I don't think it's necessarily fair for us to assume that it was just about this one subject.
Yeah. And it's interesting as we go through and look at it, he had hundreds of disciples. We read in one place that, he was making more disciples than John. So he had a lot of people following him that were following because of a teacher and wanted to know more about him. And we hear in the same passage, we have other people that were just coming out to hear him. They'd say, oh, we know this guy that he's working miracles and he's got a good message. Let's go hear him. So you had people like that were going out. Here you had these Pharisees and Scribes that were going out. They were going out for a different purpose, right? They were going out, well, let's see what we can find out that he's doing wrong. And so we start seeing a whole host of people. But here he chooses 12. And then a little later, we're going to see that he takes 3 with him. And then a little later, we're going to see that he sort of singles out Peter to do some things. And, and that's sort of a situation that we sort of look at as it transpires through the book of Luke. But I think here, some of the first things that we look here in chapter 6 is, one, he tells who he is and what his duties are. We go through and he sort of confronts the attitude of the Pharisees and Scribes, and we see right away that they start plotting what they're going to do with him. All right? And this is probably one of the first things. And then we have him choosing the 12. And then the next portion that we'll get into next week is the parallel passage for the Beatitudes, or the Sermon on the Mount that we find over in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Here in chapter 6, some of those same thoughts that are presented over in Matthew are presented here in chapter 6, verses 20 through following. And we'll pick up with verse 20 next week. All right? Any other questions before the other classes come in? All right. Appreciate it.